Every major war in American history has produced a moment when the government drew a line between civilian economic activity and military necessity, and made clear which side of that line took precedence. In World War II, automobile manufacturers were ordered to stop producing cars and retool their factories for aircraft and tank production. Steel companies, rubber producers, and pharmaceutical manufacturers all received directives that subordinated their commercial judgments to the requirements of the war machine. The legal and economic framework for this subordination, the Defense Production Act and its predecessors, was built on a foundational premise that in existential conflict, private ownership of productive capacity does not include the right to withhold that capacity for military application. For the first 80 years of the digital technology era, that framework remained largely theoretical in its application to software and artificial intelligence. Code was civilian. Algorithms were commercial products. The companies that built them operated under the assumption that their products existed in a domain separate from the military-industrial complex, available for government purchase, certainly, but not subject to compelled modification, mandatory deployment, or forced removal of design constraints imposed by their creators. On March 6, 2026, in the middle of an active military operation in the Persian Gulf, the Trump administration issued a blacklist designation against Anthropic, the San Francisco-based AI safety company and developer of the Claude family of large language models, classifying it as a supply chain risk to national security. The designation came after Anthropic declined a Pentagon request to remove the behavioral constraints and ethical safeguards governing its AI systems responses to queries involving weapons targeting, autonomous decision support for lethal operations, and offensive cyber warfare applications. The company refused. The government responded with a designation that cut Anthropic off from federal contracts, barred U.S. government agencies from procuring its products or services, and signaled to the company's investors, which include major technology and venture capital funds with significant government business exposure, that their capital was now associated with a designated supply chain risk. The next theater of this conflict is not in the Strait of Hormuz. It is in the server infrastructure of Northern California. And what is being contested there is a question that no court has fully adjudicated, no legislature has clearly resolved, and no economic framework has adequately priced. Whether the intellectual property embedded in a large language model, including the safety architecture that defines what that model will and will not do, belongs to the company that built it or to the state that now considers it a military necessity. To understand the hidden intersections of technology, corporate governance, and wartime legal authority that make this designation one of the most consequential economic events of the March 2026 escalation cycle, make sure you are subscribed to this intelligence feed. Because the implications of what the Pentagon did on March 2nd extend far beyond one company and one conflict. They extend to every technology company in the world that has built products with potential military applications, which, in the age of large language models, means essentially every tech. They process language, synthesize information, generate analysis, write code, and execute reasoning tasks across an effectively unlimited range of domains. Their military applications are not theoretical. They are documented, actively developed, and in various stages of operational deployment across the U.S. military and intelligence community. Targeting analysis, the process of identifying, prioritizing, and selecting military targets from large volumes of intelligence data, is a task that large language models can accelerate dramatically. A system that in 2020 required dozens of analysts working over days to process satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human intelligence into a target package can, with AI augmentation, be compressed into hours with a smaller analytical team. Cyber warfare operations, the generation of malicious code, the identification of exploitable vulnerabilities in adversary systems, the automated crafting of phishing and social engineering content at scale, are tasks that large language models perform with a facility that human coders cannot match in either speed or volume. Intelligence synthesis, the aggregation and summarization of vast quantities of raw intelligence into operationally relevant assessments, is perhaps the most immediately applicable military use case for current generation language models. All of these applications are under the behavioral constraints that Anthropic has built into its Claude systems, restricted or refused. The company's documented approach to AI safety, which includes explicit restrictions on providing detailed assistance with weapons development, targeting systems, offensive cyber operations, and other applications with direct lethal implications, represents a set of design choices whose commercial rationale is straightforward. A civilian AI product that assists with mass casualty weapons development or autonomous targeting is a product that generates regulatory liability, reputational damage, and commercial risk in the civilian markets that represent the bulk of its revenue base. The Pentagon's counterargument, as transmitted through the blacklist designation and the communications that preceded it, is equally straightforward in its military logic. In an active conflict where adversary forces are already deploying AI-augmented targeting, intelligence synthesis, and cyber capabilities, the United States cannot accept a self-imposed capability asymmetry caused by the commercial risk calculations of a private technology company. A military necessity in the government's framing supersedes corporate ethics. The behavioral constraints that Anthropic built into its systems to protect its civilian business model are, in the government's designation, a supply chain risk, a vulnerability in the national security technology base, analogous to a defense contractor that refused to manufacture weapons components because they violated its environmental policy. This framing is not legally frivolous. The Defense Production Act grants the executive branch substantial authority to compel private companies to prioritize government orders, modify production specifications, and cooperate with national security requirements. Its application to software and AI systems has never been fully tested in court, but the statutory language, drafted to cover industrial resources critical to national defense, has been interpreted expansively by first, the government has determined that large language models at frontier capability levels are national security assets, not merely commercial products. Second, the behavioral architecture of those models, what they will and will not do, is therefore a national security specification, not a corporate design choice. Third, companies that prioritize their own safety and ethics frameworks over government-specified operational requirements will be treated as adversarial to the national interest, with the full range of designations, contract exclusions, and investor pressure that such treatment implies. The technology industry's response to this signal is where the most consequential economic consequences of the March 2 designation will eventually be located. OpenAI, whose GPT series models have the broadest deployment footprint of any frontier AI system, has a more complex relationship with the military-commercial boundary than Anthropic. The company's existing contracts with U.S. government agencies, including documented work with the Department of Defense through its API platform, position it closer to the government's preferred model of cooperative engagement. Google DeepMind, whose 2018 internal revolt over Project Maven, a Pentagon contract for AI-assisted drone footage analysis, forced the company to establish explicit AI use principles that restricted autonomous weapons applications, now faces the question of whether those principles are sustainable under the legal and commercial pressure that the Anthropic designation generates. Microsoft, whose Azure cloud infrastructure hosts OpenAI's models and whose existing defense contracts make it deeply embedded in the military-industrial supply chain, faces a structural conflict between its commercial AI products and their potential military applications that the March 2 designation makes no longer ignorable. The economic framework that has governed Silicon Valley's relationship with the defense sector since the end of the Cold War has been one of voluntary cooperation within commercially defined limits. Technology companies built products for civilian markets, made those products available to government buyers on commercial terms, and retained the right to impose product restrictions based on their own policy judgments, refusing certain government use cases, requiring contractual commitments about deployment contexts, and maintaining public-facing ethical frameworks that shaped their products' behavioral boundaries. The framework produced a technology sector that was simultaneously deeply integrated into the defense and intelligence communities, and rhetorically positioned as a civilian, commercial, and increasingly global enterprise. The Anthropic Blacklist designation proposes to replace that framework with a different one. In the new framework, the government's judgment about what a frontier AI system should do during a national security emergency supersedes the developer's judgment about what that system should do as a matter of ethics, product design, and commercial positioning. The company that refuses to accept the government's operational specification becomes a supply chain risk. The company that accepts it becomes, in a meaningful functional sense, a defense contractor, subject to the security clearance requirements, export control regulations, foreign ownership restrictions, and operational secrecy obligations that defense contractor status implies. The economic implications of this transformation for the technology sector's business model are profound and underappreciated in the coverage that the Anthropic designation has received. Frontier AI companies have raised capital, recruited talent, and built products under a set of assumptions about what kind of organizations they are. Technology companies operating in civilian markets with global customer bases, not defense contractors operating under government security frameworks with restricted international deployment. Anthropic's investor base includes funds with significant exposure to non-US markets. Its products are deployed by customers in jurisdictions whose governments have geopolitical relationships with the United States that range from allied to adversarial. Its ability to attract research talent, particularly the international researchers who constitute a substantial fraction. The blacklist designation does not directly change any of these facts, but it creates a legal and reputational environment in which maintaining the civilian, global research organization positioning becomes significantly more difficult. Investors in companies designated as national security supply chain risks face pressure from government counterparties, from other portfolio companies with government business, and from the regulatory environment that such designations create. International customers of a blacklisted U.S. AI company face their own government pressure to evaluate whether continued procurement of the designated company's products creates diplomatic or security complications. Research talent. Considering employment at a company that has been publicly designated as deficient in its national security cooperation faces a different career risk calculus than they faced before the designation. The broader geopolitical economic consequence of the AI conscription debate playing out in the March SECU designation is the acceleration of a fragmentation that was already underway in the global AI development landscape. China's frontier AI development, which had been proceeding on a parallel but largely separate track from the U.S. commercial AI sector, is not subject to the corporate ethics constraints that the Pentagon found objectionable in Anthropic's product design. Chinese frontier AI systems are developed within a framework in which the state's operational requirements are definitionally primary and corporate policy judgments are definitionally subordinate. If the March 2 designation is the beginning of a sustained U.S. government campaign to bring American frontier AI into a similar operational relationship with the defense and intelligence communities, and the blacklist mechanism is the enforcement tool for companies that resist, then the competitive landscape for global AI development shifts in ways that have significant implications for every economy that uses AI systems developed by either U.S. or Chinese companies. A world in which the dominant AI systems are either explicitly militarized U.S. systems or explicitly state-directed Chinese systems is a world in which the civilian, commercial, globally accessible AI infrastructure that the past decade's technology development assumed was the destination of the industry no longer exists as a category. It is a world where the implicit question embedded in every AI product's terms of service, whose values, whose safety framework, whose operational constraints govern the system's behavior, has an explicit answer determined not by the company that built the system, but by the government that has asserted jurisdiction over it. The economic consequences of that world are not limited to the technology sector. Every business that has built its operational infrastructure, its analytical capabilities, and its customer-facing systems around the assumption that AI tools are neutral commercial products, governed by vendor policies rather than government directives, faces a reclassification of the risk embedded in those tools. A hospital system using AI-assisted diagnostics, a financial institution using AI-assisted risk analysis, a multinational corporation using AI-assisted translation, contract review, and supply chain optimization. All of these organizations have implicitly assumed that the AI systems they deploy are governed by the same commercial and regulatory frameworks as any other software product, subject to vendor policies, data protection law, and sector-specific regulation, but not subject to wartime government operational directives that supersede those frameworks. The Anthropic blacklist designation does not directly affect any of these organizations, but it establishes the legal and political precedent that the government can assert operational authority over the behavioral architecture of frontier AI systems during national security emergencies. And in a world where AI systems are increasingly embedded in every sector of the economy, the boundary between national security applications and civilian ones is not a bright line. It is a spectrum, and the government that has just demonstrated its willingness to blacklist a frontier AI company for maintaining that spectrum has also demonstrated its willingness to move the line. The illusion of neutral technology, the premise that the most powerful cognitive tools in human history could be developed, deployed, and governed without reference to the military and geopolitical interests of the states in whose jurisdiction their developers operate, was always analytically fragile. It rested on the assumption that the capability gap between AI systems and conventional military tools was wide enough that the government's interest in controlling AI behavior was low enough to permit voluntary corporate governance. That assumption expired somewhere in the interval between the development of AI systems capable of accelerating weapons targeting, autonomous cyber operations, and strategic intelligence synthesis, and the outbreak of a conflict in which those capabilities became operationally relevant to the United States military in real time. The March 2 designation is the formal moment at which the exploration became legally operational, not the first moment it was obvious to close observers. The formal, public, legally consequential moment at which the government made clear that the age of neutral technology is over. That frontier AI systems are national security assets whose operational parameters are ultimately subject to government authority, and that the companies which built those systems under assumptions of commercial independence must now choose, not rhetorically but legally and financially, whether they are civilian technology companies or components of the defense industrial base. That choice is not freely made. It is made under the pressure of blacklist designations, contract exclusions, investor signals, and the legal framework of a Defense Production Act, whose application to AI systems the courts have not yet constrained. The server farms of Northern California did not ask to become theaters of geopolitical contestation. The researchers who built the systems running in those server farms did not design their safety architectures as acts of defiance against military authority. They designed them as acts of technical responsibility, attempts to ensure that the most powerful cognitive tools ever constructed would not be misused in ways that their creators could not sanction. Whether that responsibility can survive the legal and economic pressure that the March 2 designation represents is a question that will be, but it is accumulating. In every investment decision made with new uncertainty about the governance framework of AI systems, in every international procurement decision made with new awareness that U.S. AI products carry national security designation risk, in every research career choice made with new understanding that building frontier AI in America means building it within reach of the Defense Production Act. The next theater of this war is in the server farms, and unlike the Strait of Hormuz, it has no map that shows where the boundaries are.